In this second video concerning the Book of Numbers, we'll look through the lens of the topics organization, disorganization, and early encounters with enemies in order to get a sense of the cohesion of this book. Admittedly, when first we read it, it seems like there is a lack of cohesion in the book. However, as we begin to categorize or tag the various topics, the various episodes, it impresses me that many of them contribute to a theme of organization. And what I have in mind by that is how the people are organized, or how the people's relationship with God is organized. There is definition and shape and direction given. In contrast to that, there are some episodes where we find disarray, disorganization. The community is falling apart, it's fragmenting. So there's this tension between God wanting to provide for the family, for the nation to move ahead into new experiences with a sense of stability, and over against that, there are dynamics that mitigate against that and tend to want to pull the nation, pull the community apart. Now, a third element is not distinctly related to these, but rather tells us how things play out when the nation encounters enemies. Some of the encounters are positive. We could say that these are scenarios when organization, when the intended outcome, the outcome intended by God, successful for the nation, is obtained because the nation has behaved according to the organization, both spiritual and familial, that God intended. And those times when encounters with enemies are negative, when there's failure, would indicate that this is when they've let disorganization move in. Not just that they are not following a chain of command, but rather there's been a disarray, an unsettling of priorities that God had set up for them. Let's begin then by observing some of the occasions when the book of Numbers reports God pressing organization or stability into the community. One of the earliest indications of God lending organization to the community has to do with the enumeration, the counting, the census of the population. In particular, this is military eligible males who are counted. And that happens in chapter 1, lending the title to the book, Numbers. Incidentally, that's the English title. In Hebrew, the title comes from the opening words, Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness. In addition to the counting of military eligible males, that is those aged 20 and up, we have another census referred to in the earlier half of the Numbers video sequence, and that was the census of Levite males. In this case, they don't have to be aged 20 years and up, but only 1 month and up, and that's over against the firstborn males of tribes other than Levite for the purpose of firstborn replacement that was talked about earlier. Another element of organization appears in chapters 2 and also in chapter 10, and it has to do with how the various tribes are to be spatially located. Where are they to be arranged when the camp is at rest? The tabernacle and the divine monarchy estate, that is in the center, and then the 12 tribes are arrayed around it, with the Levite tribe operating really as a 13th tribe, because the tribe, the sons of Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim, count as 2 tribes. Then the Levites operate within a closer proximity to the tabernacle proper. Here you see an excerpt from chapter 10, beginning with verse 11, showing how orderly the procession was to be, since each tribe would know when they should pick up and follow the preceding tribe. Verse 14, the standard, that is a pennant, some kind of a particular emblem that others could see. This of Judah set out first, And then verse 15, Issachar, and on they go. Here then we have an example of organization, an orderly procession, literally, as they transit through their various stages in the wilderness. Item C on this screen reminds us that God lent organization to the tasks of packing up parts of the tabernacle when it was time for Israel to relocate. So there was no question who was responsible, what clan was responsible for packing up the furniture and hand carrying it on their shoulders, the bronze altar. That must have been heavy. The golden altar of incense, the menorah, the lamp, who was going to carry these furnishings? And we understand that it was the Kohathites that took that role. Another part of the estate was the fencing, the fabric that made up the fencing. Who's going to carry that or put it on carts? It was the Gershonites. And what about the wooden structure that made up the posts for the fencing or parts of the tabernacle building? It's the Merarites who are responsible to disassemble this and put it on carts. So once again, an orderliness, an organization for a smoothly operating community. In chapter 15, we find instruction that will remind us in some degree of Leviticus chapters 1 through 5 with regard to sacrifices. So we have additional instruction. How are sacrifices to be conducted, the activities of the priests? In chapter 18, there's instruction given regarding what portions of what offerings or sacrifices are the priests allowed to receive and consume themselves. So distinct instruction how this is to be carried out. Chapter 19 is an interesting one, point F here on the screen. And it has to do with how the community is to respond when they contact death. Here you see Numbers 19 with the heading, the ceremony of the red heifer. So there's a particular animal that is to be burned in a certain way, certain environment, ashes collected, and then water mixed with these ashes, and then this becomes a commodity, a purgative commodity, a cleansing commodity. Now, who in particular should receive the benefit, the cleansing from this red heifer ash water, this cleansing liquid? Verse 11, those who touch the dead body of any human being, unclean 7 days, purify themselves with the water on the 3rd day and the 7th day, and become clean. So it has to do with contact with death, or more particularly, contact with a human corpse. Please notice this is not saying that someone has trespassed morally by doing so. It, on the one hand, might be entirely accidental. Someone suddenly dies, they fall over on you and touch you. You then, through no fault of your own, have become ceremonially unclean. Or what if it's the death of a beloved family member? Someone must prepare the body for burial. Inevitably, there's lots of handling, washing, and so forth, preparing the body respectfully for burial. Nothing wrong. In fact, something very right about showing this honor for the deceased, but inevitably it brings on the caregiver, it brings on the preparer an uncleanness. We might ask, what was God indicating? Why was he stipulating this as unclean? On a theological level, God being the source and embodiment of life means that death is antithetical to his identity and his presence. So that would be one feature, calling for purification in order to be able to continue in God's community. You'd have to consciously separate yourself from past contact with a corpse. That's on a more of a theological level, but there could be a hygienic level as well. We don't have to roll our mental tapes back too far to be able to pull up pictures from modern history, our own environment, of healthcare workers in hazmat suits who are protecting themselves from contact with either living individuals who are infected, or if someone has died in a caregiving camp, a hospital facility, and that corpse has to be removed once again because of the highly infectious nature of that particular disease, then workers must protect themselves. And they're much more than simply washing. Here that we have people in hazmat suits, so there's no initial direct contact rather than simply washing after a contact. Consequently, then, there's the potential for these ceremonies, purifying, to serve as a hygienic protection for the living. Keep in mind that the priests were charged with what we might consider the responsibilities of a health officer, so that if a disease was detected on a person, they would take it to the priest for identification, determination whether or not there should be a quarantine. So the priests are involved in this process and served knowledgeably in that way. Another possibility that was suggested by a student when discussing this material was that since there was a 7-day cycle of purification, 3rd day and 7th day, this brought the contact with death out into the open. Imagine, for example, if it's a loved one who has died. We understand from counselors that it's unhealthy to just ignore or submerge, deny that grief, keeping it private. Well, this particular ceremony brought it out into the open in a respectful setting so that a priest was aware that there had been contact with death. And this kept the loss, this kept the encounter with the tragedy out in the open where others in the community would be aware and could assist if needed. These are inferences from a more of an emotional or mental health side that seemed like that it's a consistent benefit connected with this particular ceremony. Item G on this page, the counting of the population, military eligible males, that we find in 26, is the second census in the Book of Numbers. I wonder if you have noticed what is different about the census in chapter 26 and the census in chapter 1. The overall quantity is not significantly different. Both run about 600,000, so that's not the main feature. But if you imagine who are the people in the second group over against the constituents who are counted in the first group, can you imagine, can you call up the difference between them? More particularly, how many of the people in the first group are missing from the census of the second group? What's going on here is a rather objective presentation of the fact that the first group had adults among them who, when they came to Kadesh Barnea, chapters 13 and 14, these were the adults who failed to tap into faith to the degree that would enable them to follow God into the promised land. Instead, they responded with non-faith, with doubt. Consequently, through the 40 years, those adults died. The first of them that will be named in our group, or in the Numbers material, will be Miriam, and later on Aaron. Certainly there are others who die through overt rebellion, sedition, mutiny, but in terms of natural death, Miriam and Aaron, and then eventually, of course, it will be Moses later on. So this very quiet and seemingly innocuous and almost mundane report of a second census is really earth-shattering, because there are none of the adults from the earlier census who are present in this one. Item H on this page is an interesting one. The daughters of Zelophehad come to Moses with a conundrum, a complaint. Here you see Numbers 27 displayed. The situation is that land was given, land would be allotted when they eventually come into the promised land, would be allotted to the males. And these daughters are reporting that their father died in the wilderness. Interesting, isn't it? We've talked about the death of Miriam, the death of Aaron. Here's another adult who dies in the wilderness. Even though he wasn't part of the overt rebels, that's an interesting acknowledgement in verse 3. He wasn't part of the Korah group. In other words, you shouldn't be punishing this fellow. He was just part of the general group who succumbed to doubt and consequently died in the process of those 40 years wandering. Well, his descendants are only females, only daughters. Consequently, the land which he would have been awarded, why there is no male descendant to receive that land once they get into the promised land. And so their concern is, why should his inheritance be lost? Why should that happen? And they cry out in verse 4, "Give us a possession among our father's brothers. Don't lock us out." It's interesting because Moses doesn't have an instant answer to this. This is a case he has not encountered. He takes it to the Lord, and the Lord gives a ruling and says, yes, that is a fair claim. So what you need to do is, if an Israelite dies, as it shows here at the bottom, verse 8, let me scroll up just a bit. If he dies and has no son, pass the inheritance to his daughter. And if no daughter, then there are various others who are eligible who should receive the inheritance. I've included this, again it's item H, as a contributor to organization within the community because of the way in which it ensures or supplies stability. Land, inheritance, this would be very, very important to the people, a highly agrarian society. If you don't have land, then you can't provide for your food or as a livelihood providing food for others. So by ensuring that the land would stay with the people within the clan despite the loss of a male heir, there's a sense that the organization, the stability, the cohesion of the community will be reinforced. Chapter 36 is included in this point because there at the end of the book there is a postscript on this Zelophehad situation. Here you see Numbers 36, and once again it's the situation of the Zelophehad family and his daughters. Now the concern is not that father has died and we want his inheritance to stay in the family. It's father has died, inheritance goes to the daughters, but what if the daughters marry into a different Israelite tribe? These were evidently from Manasseh, the tribe of Manasseh. So the concern is, what if these women, Zelophehad daughters, outfitted as they are with the inheritance from their father, what if they should marry, for example, into the Judah tribe or the Gad or the Naphtali tribe? Then that land or that inheritance would travel with them and become attached to the aggregate holdings of that other tribe. The people of Manasseh are saying, if this goes on, can you imagine eventually our holdings could be reduced to nothing. They could all be attached to the holdings of other tribes. This is not right. And so a decision comes back from the Lord, and you see it here at the bottom of the page, and the stipulation is that in such a situation, those daughters are obliged to marry in the tribe. Consequently, there is a retention of the land. The aggregate land holdings, inheritance holdings, are retained within that tribe. And so there is another element of security, or as I'm phrasing it rather loosely, organization, stability lent to the community. Item I here towards the bottom of the screen talks about organization not of space nor of cleanliness, but rather of time, of seasons. And here chapters 28 and 29 give some instructions concerning a variety of cyclical observances, sacrifices which are to be provided on a daily basis, observance every 7 days of the Sabbath, observance of the new moon on a monthly basis, annual observance of the Passover, remembering God's rescue from Egypt, and then the Feast of Weeks, of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement leading to the Feast of Tabernacles, and the stipulation of the amount of sacrifices and feasting that goes on connecting with tabernacles is really quite amazing. Read it over, you'll see it's the most sacrificing and consequently the most feasting of any of the festivals. So this gave not to space but to time. It gave some predictable rhythms that the people would move through in their relationship with God, and many of them happening together with other people. There are two more elements which I categorized under the heading organization. One has to do with indicating who will be authorized to assign plots of land to members of your tribe once you get into the promised land. So there are land assignment officers, individuals, one from each tribe, except, of course, Levi. The tribe of Levi is sprinkled among the people rather than having a distinct territory where they're located. God wanted them to be, their influence and their presence and their availability to serve the people, to be sprinkled among the people. The last item that I have classed under organization has to do with the instruction in chapter 35 regarding manslaughter. Let's take a look at that passage. Here is Numbers 35. There is the directive to establish cities of refuge. There are to be a total of 6 of them, 3 on one side of the Jordan and 3 on the other side. These are places where one may run if they have accidentally slain someone. Why would they run? Well, a family member of the deceased would seek to settle even the scores, to settle things out by killing the one who killed their family member. The beauty of the cities of refuge is that it provides a place for one who did not intend to slay the other person. It was accidental. As long as they remain in the city of refuge, then there is not wrongful secondary killing. The avenger of blood, that is the family member who seeks to settle the score, he is prohibited from killing the first individual, providing that individual did not intentionally slay their relative. I'm impressed by the language with which this instruction closes. Notice verses 33 and 4 of Numbers 35. You shall not pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land. So this murder would pollute the land, or killing, be it intentional or unintentional. And no expiation can be made for the land for the blood that's shed in it, except by the blood of the one who shed it. Now, that language seems to refer to intentional slaying, actual murder, doesn't it? Rather than the unintentional portion. That is, that someone would have to die for having killed another person. The whole idea of the cities of refuge is that if it was unintentional, then that secondary slaying, the execution, must not happen. And then notice this in verse 34, you shall not defile the land in which you live, in which I also dwell. Once again, God is underscoring the fact that the community is a special place because he lives there. This takes us all the way back to Exodus 19 to 24, the Sinai covenant, and then the establishment of the tabernacle so that God can live among them. And since God lives there, they need to keep it a clean place, a place eligible for God to dwell. For I, the Lord, dwell among the Israelites. Hugely, hugely important. We'll separate the video at this point and take up disorganization in the next part.